Welcome to you all. Well, it's my great pleasure to welcome Ernest Sosa, Board of Governors, Professor of Philosophy at Rutgers University, who traveled all the way from the United States to visit us today. Well, it's indeed a challenge to present even briefly Ernest Sosa, whose work is well known by everyone in philosophy and who's undoubtedly one of the most prominent epistemologists of the last 50 years, in particular since the classical paper in which he introduced the concept of virtue in the still traditional landscape of epistemology along reliabilist rather than responsibilist lines as a way to solve some thorny issues surrounding the basically Platonist definition of knowledge is justified true belief that had been pointed out by Goethe in 1963, namely in The Raft and the Pyramid, an article which I should mention has been translated into French and can be found in the anthology edited in 2005 by Julien Dutemps and Pascal Engel, Philosophie de la connaissance, Vrin publisher. Since then, this paper has been included in Knowledge and Perspective, which is a good introduction to Ernest Sosa's own version of virtue epistemology and to the solutions he offers to solve all the tricky issues surrounding foundationalism and coherentism, internalism versus externalism, or the problem of skepticism. Since then, he has published several major books: A Virtue Epistemology, Oxford University Press 2007, or Reflective Knowledge, Oxford University Press 2009, in which in particular he refined various concepts such as the concept of safety, problems related to what he calls animal and reflective knowledge, but also offered his own and very interesting views about the special contemporary relevance of Aristotle, Descartes, or Pyrrhonism, or explain why a third level of knowledge had in his mind to be introduced. Knowing full well, Princeton University Press came out in 2011. Some of the most recent developments of his work are to be found in his book, Judgment and Agency, which was published last year. Several collections have already been devoted to his philosophy. Let me just mention the important Ernest Sosa and His Critics, edited by John Greco, Blackwell 2004, and The Philosophy of Ernest Sosa, edited by John Curry, Springer 2013. There's going to be a special issue on his work next year in the journal Synthèse. So without further delay, I would like to thank him warmly again on behalf of us all for coming today at the Collège de France, and I shall now give him the floor for about an hour lecture on knowledge and justification, which will be then followed by about an hour discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. So, can I be heard through this? Okay, my voice is very weak, so I need this. Thank you so much, Claudine, and it's a pleasure. I'm delighted to be here, this city, this institution, this seminar. I'm going to talk about knowledge, and that'll be the first section of this talk. And then based on what I say about knowledge, I want to apply that to the idea of justification, epistemic justification, how to understand that, and then finally to skepticism, radical skepticism, and the implications for that. Now, I assume that most of the people here were not at the session yesterday. Is that a safe assumption? There was a session yesterday. I'm going to assume that most of you, because I'm going to repeat a couple of things that will be very I want to repeat some things about what knowledge is, because I want to propose a particular view about knowledge, which is unusual. It's a view that knowledge is a form of action, and in particular that it's a form of action that is means-end action. So when you know something, it's because you have acted in a way that succeeded. The way you act is through your belief. And it's a particular kind of belief that I want to focus on. It's a belief that involves affirming something, saying that such and such, that P, saying that snow is white, or when you affirm something, you can affirm it in a particular way, which is where you're aiming to get it right by so affirming. You needn't aim to get it right when you affirm. You might lie when you affirm. You might be trying to make someone feel good, to give them support. And so there are many aims that one might, of course, have in saying something, especially in saying something publicly, but even in saying something to oneself. There's a particular aim that one might have, which is the aim to get it right by saying what one does. One says that P, and one aims to get it right on the question whether P. So that's an action, it's affirming. It's an action with a certain objective. The objective is to get it right on a certain question. And so that action might succeed. If you do get it right, you succeed in your action of affirming in the endeavor to get it right. You do get it right, you succeed. But now, you might affirm with that aim in a way that is competent. You might affirm in a way that is not so competent. That is, you might make fallacies as you reach your decision to say, to give the answer that you do to your question. You might commit a fallacy, and so your affirmation might not be so competent. But of course, if things go well epistemically, your affirmation will be competent. If it's based on perception or on testimony or on inference, it'll be good perception, good testimony, good inference, and so you will competently affirm that P. Competence means that you have a reliable way to determine the answer to your question, reliable enough way to determine the answer to the question. And so you exercise that competence, you reach your answer, you give your answer, and then in the giving of the answer, in the affirmation that you make, that might be a competent affirmation or a not so competent affirmation. So that's the second respect of evaluation of the action that you take. The first respect was, do you succeed? Do you get it right? The second respect now is, how well do you give your answer? How well based is your answer? How competent is your answer? So your answer might be highly competent or competent enough. So this is a second respect of affirmation. A second respect of evaluation of your action as you affirm with that endeavor. But there is a third respect, which is it might be that you get it right and you do proceed competently, but it's not because of the competence that you get it right. There's an analogy that goes back to the Greeks that was much favored by them, an analogy to an archer who shoots at a certain target, aiming to hit that target. So there again you have an action, it's a means-end action. The archer releases the arrow from the bow with a certain objective, hitting a target. And that action of the archer you can evaluate in all the three respects that I mentioned, in the respect of whether the action succeeds. Does it hit the target? It's a good thing if it succeeds, so that's an evaluation that is positive with respect to that shot taken by that archer. It's a positive evaluation that it succeeds. You can also ask how skillful was the shot. And that'll be determined plausibly by the speed and direction of the arrow as it leaves the bow. If the arrow is well directed, then it'll be a skillful shot. There is, however, a third question we might ask about that shot. Did it succeed because of the skill? So the arrow leaves the bow, it's very well directed, let's say. In normal conditions, it would hit the bullseye, so it's a very skillful shot. It does hit the bullseye, so it is a successful shot. It's accurate and it's adroit. It has those two features, both normative features, both good things about that shot, that it was so skillful and that it did hit the target. However, it might have hit the target not because of the skill. Why? Well, because a gust might have diverted the arrow on the way to the target so that it would not hit the target, except that there's a second gust that comes along, puts it back on track to the target. Now, in that case, there is the success, there is the competence, the skill, the skillfulness of the shot, but the success is not because of the skill, it's just because of the luck of the second gust that it does hit the target. So we can now think of performances in general, attempts in general with an aim, under this threefold rubric of accuracy, adroitness or skill, and aptness. So for any performance with an aim, you can ask, does it succeed in its aim? How competent, how skillful was that performance? And was the success of the performance because of the competence exercised by the agent? You can ask all three of those questions for any performance, whatever, that has an aim. And in particular, there's epistemic performance. Again, if we go back to the kind of belief that I'm going to focus on, which is, I call it judgmental belief, is belief that involves an affirmation that's aimed at truth. You can ask about that kind of performance, the three things. Is the affirmation accurate? Does it succeed? It's aiming at truth. Does it hit the truth? Is the affirmation skillful, epistemically skillful, competent? How competent was it? And then you can ask the third question, does it succeed? Does it hit the truth? Does it hit the mark because of the competence? Is it apt? So that's the proposal on how we can think about knowledge. We can think about knowledge as, in the case of judgmental knowledge, as an affirmation that hits the mark of truth, does so competently, and does so because of the competence. So it's an apt affirmation. So that's a way to think, an initial way to think about what knowledge is. And it's a way of thinking about knowledge that makes knowledge a kind of action. Because judgmental knowledge is an affirmation in the endeavor to hit it right, to get it right. And so that's a kind of action, and you can evaluate that action then as you can evaluate any action with an aim in the three respects that I specified. And so one way to think about knowledge, judgmental knowledge, is as simply apt belief. Okay. So now, this competence that you exercise when you try to attain an aim, the skill that you exercise, as in the case of archery skill, can be understood in terms of various components. That is, there's a situational component, there's a shape component of the agent, and there's an underlying skill of the agent. One can distinguish those three things, so that in the case of archery, for example, the situation will have to do with how distant the target is, the lighting conditions, the wind conditions, and so on. And the conditions can be very unfavorable or more favorable. How favorable they are will affect how likely it is that you will hit the target when you attempt to do so. So there's a reliability component that goes with the relevant situation. There's also a reliability component that goes with the shape situation. That is, if you are in bad shape, you're drunk, say, then that will lower the reliability, the likelihood that you will succeed with your attempt. So in any case, there will be a shape component, the kind of shape that you're in at the time of action, the time of performance. And then there's finally the underlying skill, something that is an innermost component of the relevant competence that pertains to the domain of performance. So in the case of the archer keeps that innermost skill even when they're asleep. They keep it when they're in very bad shape. They keep it when the situation is very bad. So the degree of skill is independent of the shape and the situation that the archer may happen to be in at a moment of performance. The skill is a component that is seated, presumably in the brain, nervous system, the body of the performer, but that is independent of the shape and of the situation. So if we distinguish those three components, then here's a question. When somebody has the skill, say the archery skill, and they're in good shape, they're perfectly sober, alert, and the situation is good, the target is not too distant, the lighting conditions are good, the wind conditions are favorable. When those three things are in place, must it be that if the agent tries to attain the objective, then they would very likely or likely enough succeed? So do you get a safety condition satisfied as soon as you've got the three components of the competence in place? As soon as you have the appropriate skill and you have the appropriate shape and you have the appropriate situation, is it going to follow that if there is really the overall competence, then if that agent tried to attain the objective, they would likely enough succeed? So in particular, the archer, if the conditions are appropriate, lighting, wind, if the shape is appropriate, alert, sober, and if the skill is there, then when those three things are in place, is it the case that we can expect, or is it going to be the case that if they tried, they would likely enough succeed? So do you have a safety condition for the presence of competence, of full competence, that includes the three components, the skill, the shape, and the situation? If all three components are in place, and if the competence is there, then is it true that if the agent tried, then they would likely enough succeed? And I want to put it to you that that's not so. If the archer shoots and the arrow travels to the target and hits the target, it may be that that shot is highly creditable to the archer and manifests competence on the part of the archer. So it's creditable to the competence of the archer and to the archer, that success, even though it may have been highly unlikely that they would succeed, despite all those conditions being in place. Because it may be that at every point in the trajectory of that arrow, from the bow to the target, at every point, there was extreme danger of a gust intervening and diverting the arrow on the way to the target. But it may be that it just so happens, however extremely improbable it may have been, that no gust actually intervenes. At every point there was high danger, but at no point did it happen. So there's a modal property of unsafety there, even given the archer's satisfying the three conditions of skill, shape, and situation. Because in particular, the situation may have been present, no gust intervenes, but it wasn't safely present. That is, it was very probable that a gust would intervene at every point in the trajectory. It was very probable that a gust would intervene. If it doesn't intervene, then you do have the situation in place, and you do have the shape, let's suppose, and the skill. But actually, the point applies not only to the situation, but also to the shape and to the skill. So long as the skill is present, and the shape is present, and the situation, you can have the competence present that makes it the case that when the competence is exercised and the success is attained, then the success is creditable to the archer or to the agent, even though it was highly unsafe that the success would be attained, because it was highly unsafe that the skill was present. There could have been radiation or whatever that could have taken away the skill very easily. It just didn't happen. Or it might have been very unsafe that the shape was present, and again the situation, same thing. So the fact that you've got a competence in place, that competence is exercised, and that the success is attained because of the competence in a way that's creditable thereby to the agent and to their competence, their relevant competence, the fact that all of that is the case doesn't mean that the shot and the success of the shot was safely attained. It could have been very, very unsafely attained, even though it was still creditable and is still attributable to the competence exercised by the agent. Okay, so that's the basic picture about knowledge that I want to rely on. And now the new stuff beyond what happened in the session yesterday. The new stuff has to do with, again, justification, a section on justification, and then skepticism. So let's turn to that. And I've been so that's the point I've been making. Okay. Okay, so I want to argue for a knowledge-friendly epistemology, not a knowledge-first epistemology, but a knowledge-friendly epistemology. And that means that the aim is a theory of knowledge that will fit a unified epistemology, so that justification, epistemic justification, will not be disjoint from knowledge. Rather, the two will go together in the overall epistemology that will be thereby unified. Not everyone has agreed with this. Some people want to disjoin justification, epistemic justification, from knowledge, several people. But I think it's very hard to understand epistemic justification if one disjoins the relevant justification in one's epistemology from knowledge. So the objective is a unified epistemology. Okay. So let's go back to our archer and consider an archer that actually, before we do that, let's look at the this idea of a unified epistemology that will not disjoin justification, and how, in order to understand what epistemic justification is, we need to understand a state of the subject who believes, or the believer, which is constitutive of knowledge. There are various ways in which one can have reasons for affirming what one does in aiming to get it right. But many of those reasons are pragmatic reasons that don't have to do with epistemic justification. If one wants to distinguish epistemic justification, then one needs to find a place for that, and one needs to find a place for that in connection with knowledge. So what is the place of epistemic justification in the constitution of knowledge? How do they fit together in an overall virtue theory? And in order to understand that, I think we need to understand how skill, competence, epistemic skill, epistemic competence is manifest in a skillful performance. And to gain understanding of that, it will be helpful, I think, to consider a familiar thought experiment. And I mean the inverted brain example. And let's next try to accommodate that example within the virtue framework. So again, the archer's shot can be skillful without being apt, as we saw. The gusts intervene, and so it's skillful. It can even be skillful and successful without being apt. Now, take next an archer who not only wishes or hopes, but actually tries to release her arrow here and now, and tries to do so in the endeavor to hit the target. So I want to distinguish the wish that the arrow hit the target, the hope that it do so, from the archers actually trying to hit the target. Now that trying might be constituted by, or might directly yield, a certain brain state that satisfies the following condition. If the subject were in good shape, if the archer were in good shape, that state, that brain state, would reliably and generally enough lead to good orientation and speed for the arrow leaving the bow. But now, so there's the archer. He tries to hit the target. He not only hopes or wishes, he not only even decides to hit the target forthwith by releasing the bow. He actually, there's no acrasia, so he actually tries. He actually does release the bow. Now, before he actually takes that physical action, there's something that happens in trying, that happens in the brain, or in a brain-involving state of that archer, which is a state that normally will lead to the release of the arrow in the appropriate way so that it heads to the target. But suppose that what happens is at some point in the afferent nerves, something intervenes, something accidental intervenes. And it's a gust-like thing that intervenes, so that you don't get the expected effect that you would have gotten normally had not this accident happened in the afferent nerves. So you have the trying, which is constituted most innerly by the coming to be in that state by that archer. Then something happens in the afferent nerves, but something intervenes, a gust intervenes. And so you don't get the expected effect at the limbs. Now, take an invalid subject who wishes or hopes to raise an arm here and now. Let's compare that with the archer example. They even decide to raise their arm here and now, and yet they acrobatically fail to try. Take two invalid subjects, two BIVs, and suppose one of them tries and the other doesn't. Well, that's something that can matter to responsibility and to proper blame. So it isn't just what you hope for, what you wish for, not even what you decide to do forthwith. That's not all that matters, or that matters most for responsibility and blame, credit or discredit. What matters most is whether you actually try. Okay, so I want to distinguish the trying, the doing something in the endeavor to actually attain your objective. I want to distinguish that from all the other mental acts that may lead up to that, but don't necessarily amount to that. Mental acts like hoping, wishing, deliberating, finally deciding, and finally deciding here and now. So all of those we can put to one side and distinguish from what happens when you actually not only decide forthwith to act in that endeavor, but you actually try to attain your endeavor right now. So now consider that brain state that the agent enters when they actually try. That's not something that the agent brings about intentionally or by design. I mean, she's unlikely to be able to specify that particular brain state so as to be able to intentionally bring it about. But it is something that the agent does. And it's something that the agent does in a way that's attributable to them. It's something that they bring about. And they may bring about that being in that brain state when they try. They may bring it about through the exercise of a competence. Of course, that competence needn't be a competence to bring about that particular brain state, because they don't even have a conception of the brain state that would enable them to target that brain state as something to be brought about. So it's not something they bring about consciously, but it is something they bring about that's attributable to them. And there are many things that we bring about that is attributable to us without our doing so intentionally, especially consciously intentionally. Here are a couple of examples. One from Davidson, Donald Davidson. You're at a government office, you're signing a form, and there are several carbon copies. This goes back some years. Carbon copies. So you press down hard, and you're signing this form, and you think there are only 3 copies, but actually there are 5. So you sign not only the top form and the 2 following forms, you also sign that 5th form. And it's something you do, even though you don't do it intentionally. You weren't aiming to sign that 5th form. You didn't even think that there was a 5th form there. But it's something you did that's attributable to you. Okay? Take a case of a typist or a pianist in fast, furious performance, who at a certain point hits a certain key with the 3rd finger of their right hand. Again, it's not something that the performer would be likely to do by design, by intentional design, by at that moment picking that finger and that key so as to hit the key with the finger. That's not the way it works. I mean, the pianist or the typist, say the pianist has a certain phrase that they want to bring about intentionally, and in the bringing about of that, the playing of that phrase, they do at one point hit that key with that finger. And so that's something they do that's attributable to them, but it's not something they do with conscious intention by design. So I want to think of these things that we do in that sort of way, as when we sign the fifth form, as when we hit that key. I want to think of those things as deeds, to be distinguished from mere doings. So there's a broad sense of doing where, say, you're pushed off a cliff and you're even unconscious, you're pushed off, and then you squash a rabbit. So it's something you do, you squash that rabbit, but it isn't a deed, it's not something attributable to you in the way even the hitting of the key or the signing of the fifth form is attributable to you. It's a doing, it's something you do in a very broad sense. And I do think there is that sense. I mean, think of a marble at the top of an incline, and you can ask, what will that marble do if released at the top of the incline? And a perfectly good answer would be, here's what it'll do. It'll roll down unless it's glued. So that's something the marble does. It's a doing of it. But it's not a deed. It's not something it brings about through its agency in any way. So there are doings, and then there are deeds. Doings are not attributable to you as your doings, even though they're things you do. Then there's a sense of, there's a kind of doing that is attributable to you, though it's not by conscious intention that you bring it about. And these are the examples that I gave. And then, of course, there are things that you do that are not only doings, mere doings, that are not only deeds, but that are actions, let's say, which you do bring about through conscious, intentional design. So let's go back to the brain state. Perhaps then, one can bring about, the archer can bring about a certain brain state, one that's normally sufficient. Well, take the case where I'm trying to raise my arm. I can bring about a certain brain state, one that's normally sufficient for the rising of my arm, even if I don't bring it about by intentional design, because I don't even have a conception of that particular brain state. So it's not brought about by intentional design, either concurrent intentional design or aforethought. What's more, my doing that, my bringing it about that I'm in that brain state, my bringing about my being in that brain state, may be a deed. That is something that I do bring about that's attributable to me in the way the signing of the fifth form or the other case is the pianist with the fingers attributable to me. So the bringing about of that brain state is like the hitting of the key. It's an attributable exercise of competence and even skill, despite not being an intentional doing by design. What you were trying to do was something else, was raise your arm. But as a means to that, you bring about the deed of your being in a brain state, the one that normally would bring about the rising of the arm. Okay, so now exercise of skill, say the skill of the pianist, the skill of the one who signs, the skill of the one who raises their arm. Exercise of skill requires only that one manifest a disposition to succeed, which one might do through a deed, even one that misfires or fails, say because of the intervening gust in the afferent nerves. So all that's required for skill to be exercised is that you manifest a disposition to succeed. And you might manifest a disposition through bringing about this brain state that normally would eventuate in the right thing happening at the limbs, so that you would get the success of the shot or of the phrase being played or of the thing being signed. So my suggestion is, even in a simple case like the raising of your arm, you might exercise your skill, your competence to do that at will, even if you don't raise your arm, again, because something happens in the afferent nerves. But you still exercise your skill if you brought about the right brain state by bringing about which you are actually trying. It's not just you decided, or you hoped, or you wished. You actually tried, but then something happened at the afferent nerves, okay? So no raising of the arm, however, exercise of the competence to raise the arm, of the skill to raise the arm, because all it takes for that competence to be exercised is that you bring about the thing in you that normally would, in normal conditions, lead to the raising of the arm. So that's a way in which the BIV could acquire responsibility and blame and credit for things that they do when they actually try. They don't just hope or wish or decide, they actually try. When they actually try, what happens is their brain goes into the right state that would normally eventuate in the doing of the deed, and indeed the doing of the action, if they're trying to kill somebody, say. So credit and blame and so on would be properly applicable to maybe reduced blame, as when there's moral luck, but still some degree of blame and or credit could be earned by even a BIV. So now I want to suggest an analogy, bringing this back to epistemology, and it's the analogy of a BIV who manifests virtuosity in her perceptual competence, in her perceptual judgments. An analogy that I put it to you is now attractive. That believer, that BIV, if we set things up properly through proper perceptual input, that belief can be justified in so believing, even if her belief is radically false, because they're a BIV. So she still believes in an epistemically appropriate way, and the belief can still be recognizably competent or skillful. How so? Well, take a skill-like competence to perceive that one faces something red and round. So good light, eyes open, so on. So visual impact on one's eyes as one looks at the red and round object before one. And that leads through the afferent nerves to a corresponding brain-involving state, which grounds its visually seeming to the subject as if they face something red and round. Now, brain states in a certain range respond respectively to the relevant range of inputs from the vision involving afferent nerves. So the input comes in through the eyes, through the afferent nerves, and then you come to be in this brain state that grounds its seeming to you as though there's something red and round before you. Perceptually seems to you that way. So now entering that state is, first of all, something that it seems that agents do as their own attributable doing. That is, their functioning. And if they're functioning properly, that's something that they bring about through proper functioning, that they are in that state that grounds it seeming to them as if there's something red and round before them. Having entered that afferent state, which is attributable to them as a functional doing of theirs, having entered that state, suppose the agent now tries to get it right on the question whether they face something red and round. The agent might try judgmentally, intentionally, that's one way. They actually consider consciously the question, is there something red and round before me? Alternatively, the agent might just aim to get it right functionally or through psychological teleology with no conscious deliberation or intention. Either way, the agent may aim to answer the question, is there something red and round before me? So let's focus in any case on the brain state that constitutes visual experience as if one faces something red and round. On the basis of that visual experience, one can then properly try, functionally or intentionally, to answer the relevant question: is there something red and round? And this attempt, whether it's a functional attempt or a judgmental, consciously intentional attempt, that attempt can then be justified in a broad sense of justification, can be justified epistemically by being skillfully truth-conducive. This kind of skillful justification is thus compatible with failure. I mean, it's a brain in a vat, so there's nothing relevantly before them. They're still attempting to answer the question, whether there's something red and round before them. And there might or might not be skill in the answer that they give, manifest and exercised skill. So this kind of skillful justification might reside in a BIV. It's required only that the given perceptual afferent brain state lead competently to the relevant afferent brain state, which is the answering of the question, functionally or intentionally, whether there is something red and round before them. So this is the given afferent function that, when normally occurrent in a properly encased brain, would reliably enough lead to true belief. Of course, this brain is not normally encased, and so there's a lot of failure there. But there's this much success. There's the successful exercise of an epistemic competence that is attributable to the agent, and it's attributable to the agent as a deed that they bring about, a good deed that they bring about, which doesn't have to be a consciously intentional success. Okay, so in the proposal here, there's a way for a brain-invalid subject to be epistemically justified. What is that way? It's for their belief to constitute a skillful attempt to get it right, one that can still fail miserably to get it right, but still be a highly skilled attempt. And this is because the attempt resides in a deed that is normally very likely to bring success, but fails to have the expected effect only because of the agent's defective shape or situation. And so I've been working with a broad sense of epistemic justification because I wanted to make room for externalist epistemologists that require no strict deontic sense of justification that would be applicable only to free and voluntary agency. I want a broader sense that captures a broader sense of justification that, say, reliabilists and externalists generally would want. So on this broader understanding, a belief can be epistemically justified even if it is not an exercise of free agency, consciously intentional free agency, so that it attains no deontic status. It can be a matter of functioning teleologically in an appropriate way. So our sense, our acceptation is in line with a conception of competence that is, of course, applicable to free attempts, but also to deeds. So I want this broader notion. Now, a deed is, again, a doing attributable to a subject as their own doing, one that may or may not manifest competence, despite falling short of free active agency. So our perceptual competence, for example, resides largely in perceptual mechanisms whose exercise yields passive functionings rather than free actions. When things seem a certain way perceptually to us, this is not often or ever the direct outcome of any choice or intentional design. It's just teleological functioning. So in a narrower sense, there is, of course, this narrower sense, the deontic sense, where only free actions can be really justified or unjustified. And that too can be understood in terms of competence. But now the competence would involve a disposition to succeed when one freely tries intentionally by design. So now it would not be a competence that would involve a passive functioning, but it would be a disposition to succeed when one actually intentionally tries. And so the account here of skillful justification is meant to be compatible with the broad sense of justification that admits passive functionings, and compatible also with a narrower sense restricted to a deontic status that applies only to free actions. Okay, that's the section on justification. And so next I'd like to try to turn to skepticism. So let human beings pursue their daily routines some fine day based on the ordinary knowledge that enables them to do so. But what has escaped nearly everybody is that a rogue state led by a maniac has a hydrogen bomb sufficient. This is going to take some imagination. This is a hydrogen bomb sufficient to destroy all life and normality on Earth in extremely short order. The maniac is about to flip a coin that will determine our fate. Accordingly, at that point, no one really knows that even their extremely short-term predictions would turn out right. Suppose the coin turns up favorably, so that planet Earth escapes that fate, and everything goes on normally with no sign of trouble, actual or potential. Would that matter to the assessment of human performance within that time span? It would, of course, matter if the relevant quality of one's performance required proper trust in absolute conditionals and risk assessments. Take somebody who trusts that by operating the starter of her car, she would start the car. That's the sort of assumption that's needed for successful means-end actions. By this means, pressing the starter, you would accomplish that end, starting the car. If such assumptions had to be absolute, then at the time of the coin flip, human performances across the globe would fall short seriously. They would be based essentially on luck rather than knowledge. Now here I assume that the bomb, this is the imagination, the bomb is so powerful and fast-acting that its blast would obliterate all life and normality instantaneously. So if the coin flip had turned out unfavorably, the causal chain from starter to motor would have been cut short immediately, making the driver's prediction that the car would start upon pressing a false prediction. The driver assumes that if she were to operate the starter, she would thereby start the car without delay. However, given the momentous coin flip, that implicit assumption is false. Rather, if she were to operate the starter, her car would start provided the coin turned up favorably, in that rogue state way over there. If, on the contrary, she were to operate the starter while the coin turned up unfavorably, then, of course, there would be no car start, no driver. So, at the time of the coin flip, our driver is wrong to assume that if she were to operate the starter, the car would start. And yet, what do we say about the credit for her success, assuming that the coin flip turns up favorably and nothing happens and everything across the globe goes on normally? Full credit, plausibly, is dependent on the epistemic standing of her guiding belief that she would be able to start the car that way. So what should we conclude? Because of the coin flip setup, does the driver fall short of fully creditable action in starting her car because it's based on pure luck, not knowledge? Does she fall short even, again, when the coin flip comes up favorably? Anyone who draws that conclusion that our driver falls short and is not to be credited for her action anyone who draws that conclusion is focused on the epistemic shortfall that derives from the coin flip setup. The epistemic shortfall is thought to affect not just epistemic performances, but human performances generally, means end performances that are based on assumptions or beliefs about the right means. The epistemic shortfall is thought to affect human performances generally. Performances are very generally based on guiding means end beliefs and assumptions. And the quality of such a performance will depend on the epistemic quality of those beliefs and assumptions. Okay, but what is that required epistemic quality? It seems implausible that human performance would be spoiled across the globe when the maniac coin flip could so easily have gone the other way. Human performance seems unaffected by any such element of luck, epistemic performance included. So it can't be that our performance quality at that fateful moment depends on knowledge that relevant background conditions do hold. Now, we properly assume as a default that relevant background conditions will actually hold. By contrast, we need not rule out the mere danger that a background condition might fail to hold. Although background conditions must actually hold for creditable, successful action, they can hold by luck, despite grave danger. Recall the archer with the grave danger of interfering gusts. Now, of course, not just any kind of luck affects the quality of an attained success or of an achievement. It may be lucky, again, that the achiever retains their skill, or is in good shape, or is well situated, or is even alive. Many essential elements of achievement can depend on luck that does not diminish achievement. A case in point on the present proposal is that of background conditions assumed to hold. A background condition might be essential to the success of a performance while holding only by luck and beyond the ken of the performer, without any knowledge on the part of the performer. But that particular sort of luck may have no effect on the quality of the achievement. And this phenomenon, I put it to you, can be found across the spread of performance domains. Consider, for example, athletic or artistic domains. Performance in such domains properly assume by default that relevant background conditions hold as a matter of course. Consider an athletic event that takes place at night. It's assumed by everybody that the lights are not going to fail mid-performance, causing the athletes to perform poorly. If in a certain game the lights in fact stay on only by chance, because a lighting system is so likely to fail, that casts no reflection whatever on the quality of athletic performance in that game. In other words, night athletes do need to presuppose that their SSS, skill, shape, situation, competence, is adequate for a sufficiently safe attempt when they try to hit a basket or score a goal. So they do need to presuppose that their SSS competence is adequate for a sufficiently safe attempt. What they need to presuppose is that relative to their SSS competence, their attempt is likely enough to succeed. They need to presuppose that if they made their attempt and their SSS conditions were still satisfied, they still had the right skill, the right shape, the right situation. If all of that were in place, then they would likely enough succeed. And that competence is determined by a combination of skill, shape, and situation that's good enough to ensure that the agent's attempt would likely enough succeed. Now, we properly assume favorable background conditions across domains of human performance, athletic, artistic, epistemic. Agents perform based on an assumption, normally implicit, that their relevant SSS competence makes their attempt safe enough. In other words, they assume that given their SSS profile, they will succeed safely enough. Okay, so what is a background condition? A nighttime athlete has a likelihood of success determined by their skill, shape, and situation. Moreover, his attempts are well selected only if the agent is likely enough to succeed given his SSS profile and given that he assesses relevant risk well enough. The athlete needs to consider various shape and situation factors: how tired he is at the moment when he's deciding whether to make the attempt, how tired he is, how far from the target, and so on, for the many shape and situation factors that can affect performance. But there are many factors that he does not need to heed. It's no concern of an athlete as such, whether an earthquake might hit, a flash tornado, hydrogen bomb by a maniac leader, and so on. As an athlete, he's not negligent for ignoring those factors. Background conditions come in three sorts, corresponding to the three parts of the SSS structure of competence. So they can concern either the situation, or the shape, or the skill. A background condition is a condition that must hold if the relevant S component of the overall competence is to be in place at the time of the performance. Thus, the presence of the pertinent skill, or shape, or situation will entail respective background conditions that must then hold. What makes such a condition a mere background condition is that, although it must hold, the performer need not know that it will hold, nor need it hold safely. Reducing the safety of that condition, say the lights, would not reduce or in any way affect performance quality. So, radical skepticism and relevant alternatives. Against the skeptic's use of radical skeptical scenarios, it is often objected that being so remote, brain in a vat scenario, the evil demon scenario, being so remote, they can safely be assumed to be false. Our account enables an objection that's independent of any such appeal to safety or remoteness. As we have seen, inability to rule out even very close danger might have zero bearing on quality of performance. And there's hence an independent and still telling objection to the skeptic, namely that his possibilities are like the possibility that the lights go out in a night game. Even present danger that the lights will go out need not affect our assessment of performance on the field, nor need the players pay any heed to that present danger, since it is irrelevant to the athletic quality of their performances. As they run to the goal, as they aim at the basket, they don't need to pay any attention to whether the lights are going to stay on or not, because that's a background condition that is of no concern to them as athletes. As we have seen, all they need is a correct assumption that the danger will not in fact be realized. So analogously then, epistemic players may have no need to rule out the irrelevant alternatives posited by the skeptic. So the analogy now is between the athlete in their performance domain, the night game, and an epistemic player, one of us, in a normal epistemic domain where we're forming beliefs, affirming in the endeavor to get it right, and so on. Consider the BIV skeptical scenario. If that scenario were actual, that would, of course, affect our epistemic performances, just as the lights going out would affect the performance of players in a night game. But the merely modal fact that some such scenario is a close and present danger would not affect the quality of our epistemic performances. This is drawing the analogy now to the athletes in the night game. Would not affect the quality of our epistemic performances, just as a merely modal fact that the lights might go out affects not at all the quality of athletic performance on the lighted field. Nor need such a skeptical scenario be ruled out knowledgeably, just as the lights going out doesn't need to be ruled out knowledgeably by the nighttime athletes. Accordingly, perhaps we need not rule out radical dangers in order to sustain the quality of our epistemic performances. Our response to the skeptic is that he has mistaken what is required for the epistemic quality of our ordinary judgments and beliefs. His mistake is like disparaging a superb baseball catch as due essentially to luck, because unbeknownst to the fielder trying to make the catch, the lights could so easily have failed. So you say it was luck, because look, the lights could have failed. After all, no one in our imagined stadium could rule out such a failure knowledgeably. So by hypothesis, the lighting system is extremely likely to fail, unbeknownst to anyone. How much time do I have?
Take your time.
Okay, so a response by the skeptic. Granted, there is potentially important difference between fully apt athletic performance by nighttime athletes and fully apt epistemic performance by an ordinary believer. Nighttime athletes might still be thought not to be threatened by the iffiness, by the chanciness of the required background conditions, the lights, even when these cannot be known to remain probably enough in place. Less plausible, however, is the thought that epistemic players can similarly perform perfectly well despite a similar, now epistemic defect concerning their required background conditions. Can we really know about hands or fires before us if we cannot rule out that we're victims of evil demons or invaders? Surely we cannot just ignore the epistemic standing of our underlying common sense framework of beliefs. And that does seem plausible, granted. However, we do enjoy full epistemic standing for trust in our Moorean common sense, I would argue. For one thing, the cases we've been considering of iffy, chancy background conditions are quite different from the familiar skeptical scenarios. Radical skeptics do not even suggest that our common sense framework is actually unsafe. Their argument is independent of that. And so I think that is a separate issue to be tackled separately, as I've tried to do in other writings. But even bracketing that, we still have a considerable response to the radical skeptic by pressing the analogy between the following two things. A, how the quality of a great catch, baseball catch, under the lights is not affected by any need for the fielder to trust knowledgeably that the pertinent background conditions were likely enough to hold, that the lights were likely enough to stay on. The analogy between that and, secondly, how the quality of a brilliant belief by Sherlock or brilliant belief by a lookout at the top of a mast, how this quality, this epistemic quality, would be similarly unaffected by any similar need to trust knowledgeably that the believer's pertinent background conditions were likely enough to hold. And so that's the analogy that I've tried to make plausible by examples like that of the maniac and the coin flip. Now, there is a problem which involves closure. In rejecting knowledge transmission and even knowledge closure, we make no such claim about justification. Our stance here concerns knowledge specifically. It has no immediate bearing on the closure or transmission of justification. Suppose something defeats the spectator's justification. The spectator's in the stands, it's a night game, the lights are on, but very probably they're going to fail. So suppose something defeats the spectator's justification for believing that the lights will stay on. So I'm assuming the spectator can still be justified in believing that they will stay on, even though objectively it's, the chances are very low that they will stay on. So suppose something defeats the spectator's justification for believing that the lights will stay on. That will plausibly impact his justification for believing that the fielder is likely to succeed as the fielder runs to make the catch. So it'll impact that justification too. And indeed, so that's not being denied. That is, if you lose your justification for believing the lights will stay on, you also lose your justification for believing the catch will be made. And so if justification is closed under competent deduction, that will reveal a limit of our alternative defense against the radical skeptic in terms of the analogies I've been drawing. Because we're still then going to have to tackle the traditional skeptical problematic based precisely on the proposition that we lack justification for rejecting the skeptical scenarios. After all, given justification closure through competent deduction, this would make it very hard to see how we could possibly be so much as justified in our ordinary beliefs about hands and fires. And so more work would be needed in order to resist the radical skeptic's justification-based reasoning. And that's a job that I have myself undertaken elsewhere. And so there I would retreat to that other work. Finally, note in any case how performing full well does not require us to know that we would likely enough succeed, just in general. As we have seen, a certain background condition can be required for our success when we make an attempt, when we perform. And we can succeed with that attempt, with that performance, with full credit, even if we fail to know that the background condition is in place, even if we fail to know even implicitly that the background condition is in place. All we need is a justified assumption that it is in place, even just a well enough justified implicit assumption. And so such a background condition can pertain to our sustained SSS conditions, skill, shape, situation conditions, relative to which we can predict success properly. And so in order for an agent to attain success full well, what is required is that they know that if the pertinent SSS conditions were in place, they would likely enough succeed. But the agent doesn't need to know that those conditions will be in place. He need only be able to assume justifiably, reasonably, that they will be in place. Take a case where we do not know that we will enjoy the full competence required in order to be likely enough to succeed if we try, the full SSS competence required. So we do not know that we will have that full competence. Suppose it to be indeed the case that we are not at all likely to succeed if we try, because we're not at all likely to have our relevant SSS competence remain in place. In this case, our success will, of course, be importantly lucky. However, as I've argued, this need not be a case of luck that spoils performance by lowering its quality. Not all luck spoils performance. Thank you.
So maybe I have one question myself, which is in fact close to the question which was raised by Paul about the relationship between skill and success. I'm on your side totally about the relations you make this, because myself I hold a not very different point of view in terms of a kind of would-be disposition that might be enough in a way to have a less demanding requirement than the one you're used to have in order to reply to the skeptic. However, precisely my worry is the one that has to do with all the philosophers who in the end rely too much on dispositions in terms of identifying the type of ability or capacity that you have to appeal to in order to bring about the kind of virtue you need. Namely that, suppose really that the disposition never succeeds, would you still be willing to say that it doesn't matter? That, you know, I mean, from a metaphysical point of view, so it's the typical Armstrongian objection to the dispositionalist, if you wish. If it's a disposition which never, a single one, you know, leads to success or never comes about, right? Can we still give it some?
Right. I guess that would be my inclination, is to hold on to the view even in that radical case. So it would be a case where, say, the disposition almost never or never succeeds because everybody is invalid. But very easily, it might have been that nobody was invalid, or at least one person was not invalid. And then I would want to recognize the kind of skill that is, because it's all relative. The way I view it anyway, it's all relative to humanity. It's human knowledge that I'm interested in. And so although there are these possible scenarios that seem metaphysically possible, where everybody is invalid, I want to assess what goes on in those scenarios in the terms that are of interest to me, namely the human knowledge terms. And so I can see in that scenario something that is crucial to human assessment. That is, I can see the exercise of competences that would, in a normal human, result in flourishing and success. And so I just recognize that status because I rigidify to humanity as we are.
Thank you very much.